Thank you very much. Welcome back to the House Committee on General and Housing. It is Friday still. Thank goodness, January 31. And our next witness is Brian Pine, who is the Director of Community and Economic Development Office of Burlington. And the second of what we hope will be three witnesses today on the issue of short-term rentals. Before we start, I just want to say that we can take this testimony, which is taking a little longer than we thought, to lunch. And then at 1 p.m. we have Maura Collins coming back for important testimony, and then that's it for the day. And people can, I know, go, sit here and just work, right? After that. So
Mary.
and I know Lenore will leave in a moment. So why don't we introduce ourselves to Brian? Okay.
Hi, Brian. I'm Rep. Emily Krasnow, South Burlington, Chittenden 9.
Claudia Lamont from our Washington district, that's Morristown, Elmore, Worcester, Woodbury, and a small part of state.
Hello, I'm Mary Howard. I represent Rutland District 6.
Good afternoon, I'm Gail Pezzo, Chittenden 20, Colchester.
I'm Tom Charlton, Athens, Chester, Grafton, and Wyndham.
Joe Parsons, Newberry, Thompson, and Groton.
And I'm Mark Mahaly. Welcome. I represent Calais, Plainfield, and Marshfield. And we have two members out sick, and a third, as you know, is going in the ambulance with her intern or her person who's following her. So this is the committee for today. And I thank you and we'll bring Ashley and the others up to date on your testimony, in addition to the fact, of course, that it's recorded. So thank you for coming, Brian. If you would introduce yourself for the record and take it away.
Sure, thank you. I'm Brian Pine, the Director of the City of Burlington's Community and Economic Development Office. I have served in this role since June of 2021, although I was the an assistant director of that department from 1996 to 2015. Prior to that, for 4 years, I served on the Burlington City Council in the early 90s. I started my career 35 years ago right here in our capital city, working for a statewide organization. So I've been to all of your towns because we're a statewide nonprofit called the Vermont Community Loan Fund. And it was an organization that started very small. There was two of us. It's a very large financial institution today, serving economic development, affordable housing, childcare, working economy, working landscape. And so it's good to be here.
BCLF, I believe, as most of you know, I was involved in the renovation of our local store, which had 3 residential units, and BCLF gave us our construction loan.
I served for a while as a consultant, and that was my project, working with partners. Now the store was
I
my.
confess that Brian and I actually know each other.
We have that relationship, but I'm not doing that anymore. I'm for the public sector now entirely. So I'll just share my personal story with short-term rentals just quickly. Is that in 2018, when I decided the kids were gone and I was at a stage in life where I could get back into public service, I started to go door to door to seek my old city council seat was open. I went for it. And I kept hearing both people who said, I need to be able to keep doing the short-term rental to be able to stay in this house, and neighbors saying it's squeezing our housing supply. And we've got issues with parking, and people are carrying suitcases up and down the street, and they're noisy at night. Like, there's impacts on both sides. And so I really come at it from the perspective of there's some pluses and there's some minuses. And I think I introduced the idea to then Mayor Weinberger that we as a city should grapple with this. And he honestly said, after we did Uber, that was like 2 years of complete headaches. We don't want to touch this short-term rental thing. It will be something very similar if we take it on. But I felt that we should balance the public good and the private interests and needs for people to be able to use their properties to meet their needs. So I think taking a balanced view of this is really, to me, the most important thing. And then at the city level, it took us 2 years from the time that I introduced a ordinance in, I think in 2019, and it was adopted in 2022. So actually 3 years it took of debate on what was going to be the best approach for Burlington. I think, contrary to what the prior speaker said, having the ability at the local level to address your local needs and tailor your response and your local law, basically your ordinance is your law, to meet your local needs is actually critical. And it's like a bedrock of Vermont, is that you give communities some ability to respond to their needs that aren't already taken care of by state law and state legislation. And so that's an example where local control actually does work. And I think I was pleased to hear some committee members express that this is kind of more of a local issue than a statewide issue. However, if the state were to set a floor and say, this is the bare minimum, we want registration annually, we want to know how many units, we want to know basic information, and you're going to file a registration fee, and beyond that, local communities will decide. That is an approach that has worked in other areas of state law and state legislation. We in Burlington regulate rentals differently because of our significant, we have 11,000 rental units, more housing units in rental than most Vermont towns even have, period. So we have a very rigorous rental housing inspection. It starts with a state code, and then it adds to that and adds layers above the state level. So it's additive. The state is sort of a floor, if you will.
You said you had 11,000
Just straight rental units.
rental units.
Yeah, yeah. And about 6,000 owner occupied units. So it's quite a heavy rental city compared to,
In that 11?
no, on the top of. So it's a 17,000 total housing units. Yeah, yeah. So after 2 years of debate, we came up with an ordinance, and I think can you put it up on this screen, Magali?
Yeah.
So we knew each other because Magali was an intern in our office, so
Oh, that's fine.
it does work like that.
Yes.
I know Vermont does do that. So we are one of those towns, those 20 or so that the prior speaker spoke about, with a local ordinance. And I think I made my point about why local makes sense. What I wanted to do for you today is to run through some of the basics. And so we'll go through a quick slides. I think you printed them out for every committee member already, but you've all been busy, so you haven't had a chance to look at it. Let's go through the slides.
And
Yeah.
also, first of all, many of us have not asked for printed
Oh,
copies.
okay.
And she only distributed printed copies to those who prefer that.
The paper people.
The paper
All in
people.
our office.
And some of
We have a
us
few that
paper
are-
people
yeah.
don't even get them.
All right.
And,
Gen X and.
also, there's people watching,
Of course.
on
Great, so
video,
this will be-
and this is what they see.
Great. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. We've done the introductory remarks. There's some info, just how to reach me. I think I covered earlier that we had adoption in the summer of 22 after really almost 3 years of discussion and debate. I would note that it shows up first as a public policy idea from the Mayor's Housing Summit of 2019. And there wasn't great consensus then what to do about it, but it was just acknowledged this is something we better get our hands on, because it's a significant issue for a community that struggles, as Representative Dodge said, with an incredibly low vacancy rate, hovering around 1%, meaning every 1,000 units of housing, we've got 10 theoretically available apartments. So, yeah. Next slide. These are the basic provisions of our rental, short-term rental registration requirement. There is a registration requirement, and it's different for partial unit or whole unit. And I guess to think of whole unit, it's as simple as that. You've got either a house that you're renting the entire house for short-term rental, or an apartment that you've converted. Whereas if you have a house and you have a room within it, that's a partial unit, and that gets treated a little bit differently because the owner is living in the house. So that's an annual registration. There's a range of data that has to be provided to the city with that registration. You do pay an annual registration fee, but the monthly remittance is based on sales. That's basically it's essentially like a room's tax that is paid. So in addition to the state tax of 9%, the city levies a 9% tax. And that tax, I will show in a minute what it funds and how much it has raised. You have one registration submitted to the city per host. So no matter how many units you have, you still just have one registration to submit. I mentioned earlier the rental housing standards in Burlington. We refer to those in our city ordinance as those minimum housing standards. You must meet those and you get inspected by the city on a periodic basis. Our inspection is, think of it like this, if you get a good grade, city's not going to come back for 5 years probably. But if you get some failures, you're going to see someone much more often. That's how the
That's the
city.
same. So it doesn't matter whether you're renting, whether you're a landlord, you're renting your unit out permanently.
Or short-term.
or
That's the
short-term.
same, treated
You
the
have to meet
same.
The same standard.
Exactly. Yep. Next slide. We have levied this money and used it for our very own housing trust fund, which was formed almost the same time that the state formed the Vermont Housing and Conservation Trust Fund. And so our Burlington Housing Trust Fund, I'll talk a little bit about what we've used that money for, but that's where, as it shows here, of the 9%, 2% goes to general administration, monitoring, and enforcement, and the remaining 7% goes to the Burlington Housing Trust Fund. Next slide. So since the enactment, September of 22 is when it went to effect, through November, which is the month we have the most recent data for, this is the total collected in Burlington for short-term rentals, just under $2 million. The portion that goes to the Housing Trust Fund is the $1.5 million, and showing you that roughly on a monthly average, we're bringing in about just under 58,000 per month. I would note that the Housing Trust Fund revenue has been almost doubled from around plus or minus 600,000 a year in revenue from the property tax, which is really what the voters approved when we created the trust fund 35 years ago. So we've doubled it, more than doubled it with the short-term rental revenue. So it really has been a significant source of revenue to support affordable housing. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute when I have a list. Next slide. This just shows how it varies by month. I will note that the part of the chart that is here in blue is the fiscal year we're in now, and that's why it's only about half the bars are filled. But the remainder is what we've seen over the last previous 2 years, so FY23 and FY24, showing that there's monthly fluctuations. We don't, I think the testimony earlier that short-term rentals have increased dramatically. We don't know that that's the case over the time period. We don't have anything to tell us is or isn't, so I don't really have an opinion on that. But this shows you that there's seasonal fluctuation that happens pretty much every year.
Why wouldn't you know, since you have a registration?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you know whether short-term rentals?
We know what it is now, but prior to the enactment of the ordinance,
Right.
we don't have great data for that.
Right.
So it was a very confusing process before we had the ordinance. What owners were required to do was to operate as really like a bed and breakfast. That's what they're required to do, which meant a certain amount of parking spaces. It was pretty onerous to meet it. It was actually, that's why homeowners actually would say, we need help with short-term rentals because we want to be able to do it, but we can't meet that B&B standard. So don't make us meet that. And so this is really a compromise to come up with something that allows you to keep doing it. So next slide, please. This is just sort of the monitoring and enforcement side of things. So it's handled by a Department of Permitting and Inspections. They handle, the relationship with a private company called Host Compliance. They're the company that private sector firm that actually monitors the sites, the platforms. So VRBO, Airbnb, all of those, they're constantly scouring it to see what's in Burlington. That's how we know what there is in Burlington. I will note previous testimony about the AirDNA. I sometimes have to think about it for a minute because it's an odd name, but AirDNA has a different number than this 204 units. And they have quite a bit more in their system than we do. And it's not clear entirely why that is. So we're going to sort of get down to that and figure that out. But the initial hunch is that AirDNA captures people who have chosen to do short-term rental for just a very brief window of time. And yet the regulation doesn't necessarily always capture that, because someone could say, we've got our parents coming for a month in January. We have a new baby. They're going to be here. Let's free up the apartment for that. That's the type of stuff you really hear about, is people literally using it for that purpose.
Yes.
Yeah, I just was curious, what happens if, I think I know the answer, but I want to say it for everyone. What happens if I'm a short-term rental owner and I'm just like, I'm not doing that. I'm not registering, paying, doing, what's the enforcement? How do you know if someone's actually doing it?
So
Is it honor?
fortunately, our department doesn't have to go to these owners and say, we now know that you're using short-term rental and you're not filing, you need to file, but that's permitting inspections. So
Okay.
they are the police power of the city when it comes to these types of enforcements, and they contact owners, they will show up, knock on doors,
Okay.
talk to people, that kind of thing. So
Do you know, I guess your department doesn't deal with it, but do you think most people are complying with this or?
I think the vast
There's
majority
always
of
gonna be
people,
an outlier,
Yeah.
right?
yeah, I believe the vast majority of people want to comply. That's just, I think that's the human nature. They don't want to be a scofflaw, really.
Sure.
They can avoid it. There are a few you'll find that just literally haven't been paying attention and they don't know. So,
Right, because you also have what's different than some communities where you have a owner occupied. Right?
you mean, oh, if owner occupied is required?
Well,
So,
didn't you, in your regulation, I followed it pretty closely, but
yeah,
correct me if I'm wrong, in
the owner
Burlington.
needs to live on the property.
Right, that's what
Yeah,
I'm saying,
that's right,
so that's
exactly.
different than some communities. So that's what I mean, like, maybe they're like, well, we don't, so we don't wanna register, you know what I'm saying?
People are trying to get, some are trying to get around it.
That's what I'm thinking,
Yeah,
No, wait, I am confused now.
sorry.
The owner, well, not very. The owner, in order to be a short-term rental, the owner has to live on, I thought you said that there was partial and total.
that's when you live, say you live in a 2-unit building and you live on one side and you do short-term rental on the other.
Yes,
That's considered a whole unit.
okay,
But if you have a 4-unit built, well, I'll just use, if you have a multi-unit property, you have a limit as to how much of the property can be used for short-term rental. And there is an owner occupancy requirement.
so there's an owner occupancy requirement for the structure in which the short-term
Yes.
rental occurs.
Exactly.
What if, to use the prior testimony, we heard that, for example, someone will say, well, I have a house here or a unit and I want to keep it, but I live somewhere else. What are they? They rent it out. What are they? They rent it out for less than 30 days,
That would meet the definition of the short-term rental.
even though they don't live there.
That would not be allowed, but yes, that would be a short-term rental by definition.
What do we, well, how? If you have someone who lives somewhere else, but has an apartment and they do short-term rental rather than long-term. And they wanted to comply with whatever law is appropriate in Burlington, what would they be?
So this
This is a
your
person,
scenario is,
like, the prior witness, Julie Marks, testified just now that a lot of the people who are short-term renters in Vermont are people who live in Florida or live somewhere else and just want to keep that house. And so to help offset the cost, they rent it out for short periods.
yes.
What is that person under Burlington law?
Illegal.
Yeah, not allowed.
Yes, that's not what the short-term rental
They're
ordinance.
not short-term rentals. Are they long-term? What are they?
Well, I mean, if you're doing it as a regular rental, yes, you'd feel long-term rental.
So if you're absent from
You're
your, if you're
absent
absent from the
and
building
you're
for 6
renting it,
months
then
because
you
you're
never rent it for
sober.
more than 30 days. You're just in the short-term rental business.
Right.
You would be just considered a rental,
Yes.
a
You
permanent.
go to a rental, yeah.
Yeah, and you don't differentiate between on the rental on how long they rent. Doesn't matter whether they rent for a week, a month, or a year.
Well,
Rental.
in that case, if they were operating on a regular basis where they're churning people in and out.
Yes.
Be treated as a short-term rental,
Even if they don't live there,
yes, it would have to be, yeah.
they would just be violating that provision.
The owner occupancy requirement would not be satisfied, yeah. Yep,
Okay.
yeah, next slide. Again, the AirDNA data shows significantly more units. Ours is a little over 200 and theirs is 324. We have not great data on what's going on there. Don't know exactly. We have, there are listings that show up in Airbnb that are inactive. And yet they're still in their count, but they're not registered because they're not currently renting them. So there's a fairly, there's some complexity there with whether they're active. So we feel that the city feels that the number of 204 is the, is a legitimate number of short-term rentals that are operating in the city. Again, this shows you over time, this is using the VHFA's database is where this data comes from, which is AirDNA. That's where they get it.
Is this, do you have the data from after your ordinance went through? Have you seen the changes in numbers?
We'd have to have the baseline before the ordinance. Again, we didn't have great data on that because we didn't have a way to capture that, so that's not available.
Okay,
Yep.
that makes sense. Thank you.
What we could do is look at AirDNA data from before, and that number I thought was somewhere between the three to high threes, like low threes to high threes, was what I believe was the case when the city was looking at creating the ordinance.
Mhm.
So it doesn't look like a huge amount of difference. Looks fairly level.
Okay.
That's pretty anecdotal though at this point. I don't want
That's all
to
right.
swear by it. Yep. Next slide. So this is where we see what it has contributed in revenue to the Burlington Housing Trust Fund. And what we have is in white, that's the revenue to the Housing Trust Fund from the short-term rental registration fee, or I should say the tax. And the blue line is the number of units that are reporting. Again, seasonal variations, seasonal fluctuation. We see a real slowdown during the late fall and the holiday season. Big drop off, but there's been some fluctuation in revenue. But again, it's about 50 to 60,000 a month in revenue to the trust fund. Next slide. This just attempts to show number of reservations in relation to revenue. That there's not a great correlation. There's a little bit of a correlation you can see at some point when it drops way off. But number of reservations is how many nights is each room, each unit that's being leased out on a short-term basis. So perhaps not the most useful slide, maybe. To some statisticians, they find it interesting, but next slide.
But you said that's reservations per night, not per chunk of nights.
It's if you,
Was that?
by month, exactly, by month. So if you have 200 units out there, how many nights are they being filled is what that is.
Okay,
So, because some just sit for a week or two at a time, don't
yeah,
have anyone in them.
Yeah.
That's about, yeah.
This looks identical.
What's that?
It looks identical. The revenue versus units and the reservations.
Yeah, the blue line that goes through that slide. So we'll have to back up if we're going to go back to look at that. Yeah.
The white bars are the same thing.
Yeah, you're looking at the white bars. Those are the same. They would be the same because that's revenue. That's the revenue. That should be
Okay.
exactly the same. So the slide before that shows revenue at the same exact level because that's showing revenue. So that number should be the same.
okay.
That's why it's different. Okay, go on to, this just shows what was funded in the last funding round. Spectrum Youth Shelter, Cathedral Square. It's basically a sign program to help seniors with visual impairments be able to navigate their property. COTS has a housing resource center to help move people from homelessness into permanent housing. Champlain Housing Trust, this is sort of their operating cost to operate the trust fund, the Champlain Housing Trust. On the project grant side, we have a duplex that Green Mountain Habitat for Humanity has constructed. Champlain Housing Trust has taken down the former VFW and is building a new building that will replace the put a new VFW, but it will have housing above, and that's what Post Apartments is. Cambrian Rise is the former Burlington College, also known as the St. Joseph's Orphanage, where they're creating 70 housing units 30 of which are affordable homeownership, 40 are rental, and then internet access for seniors at Ruggles House. These are the projects that were funded in the most recent rounds. And this is the type of purpose that we put the dollars to that come in through the short-term rental. And next slide. There it is.
Question
Try to keep it to 30.
for you. You started off by saying when you were running and talking to people, you sort of saw both sides, and one side was concerned over the noise and, just the lack of community because you had short-term visitors rather than long-term renters. I guess has this ordinance addressed those concerns in any way?
It's a great question. I don't know. I think to the extent that we have the data, the registration, the addresses, the number of units that are being used as short-term rentals, it does give the code enforcement side of the city a little bit of information to then respond if someone says, we have a real garbage problem at, 123 Main Street, and we can't figure out who is creating it because people are coming and going all the time. And then the city looks at the registry and they say, oh, that's why, it's because it's a short-term rental. So then they know they're not going to get it by talking to the tenants because they're changing every day. So they then start to work with the owner. So yeah, it does address those issues. It gives the city a chance to say, you have a lot of people coming to this building who bring cars, and there's just not enough places to put the cars. We have a real problem here. So
Is, at the time of the debate over the ordinance, was there a discussion of either of limiting the number of short-term rentals?
I think there was everything from we should do nothing to we should ban it. Everything in the middle. Really was. The full gamut was being debated. Yep. There were some who felt we have hotels. We have plenty of hotels. So they're pricey. So this is definitely a little more affordable. I think I can see both sides.
I say, if you look at the hotel pricing in Burlington these days, my goodness, you're like 300.
Let's, unless people have questions, I'd like to move on to Austin. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Austin, unfortunately, you don't have too long.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it.
I did warn Austin a few weeks ago that when he comes in to talk about this, it better be fast, because we tend to ask a lot of questions and so.
Happy to come back too if you want to talk
Well,
more.
why don't we start?
Yeah.
And introduce yourself and
Yeah.
and then try to give it to us in a journalistic form. That is, all of it in one sentence, all of it in a paragraph, all of it in however long you can.
I can be pretty concise. So for the record, Austin Davis, Director of Government Affairs with the Lake Champlain Chamber. I think the bottom line of this is, I think a lot of folks in this room or some of the folks who have been legislators in the past in this room know that the chamber is always coming at any of these things with a lot of nuance. For some background, I think I expressed this the last time I was in here. I think I was under a time crunch then too, but the chamber operates Hello Burlington, which is the regional marketing organization for the greater Burlington area, focused on the visitor economy. And we like to use the terminology visitor economy because, I think at this point, tourism's become have a little bit of a negative connotation to it, kind of brings up the idea of somebody in a Hawaiian shirt with a camera who's kind of being rude and ignorant. What we're focused on is visitors. And that means we're also talking about people who travel for work to the greater Burlington area, folks who are coming for conferences, folks who are coming for leisure, and then, folks who are just coming for family. What we're doing is we're trying to create a relationship with those people, whether they come or if they're thinking about coming, and we're marketing to the outside world, the region, and everything it has. I think that's an important thing for us. In the chamber, we moved away from talking about tourism and really just talking about visitors, hence the term Hello Burlington. So from a personal perspective of this, I'm the child of a bed and breakfast owner up in St. Albans. And grew up my entire life in the hospitality industry in one way, shape, or form or another because of my mom. I think that for her, when she became a single mom, that was the career path that made the most sense. She could be there for me to put me on the bus and for when I got off the bus, she could make sporting events, all those kinds of things. It was a flexible career path. So I think I certainly understand the perspective of the lodging properties, many of which are my members, when it comes to the disparity of treatment between short-term rentals and lodging properties. I'll also say I actually operate a short-term rental myself. I have a accessory dwelling unit in my home that's primarily used for family. I have retired in-laws who have split their time between here and the South, and they help out with childcare. That's part of our childcare strategy. When you folks keep me here long hours, it's really good to have in-laws that can help out. I think there's a lot of nuance to this. I think we got at that in the conversation already today. STRs are important to the visitor economy, and they have a place in the visitor economy. A lot of folks aren't going to travel unless they can have an STR. They're not interested for any sorts of reasons with the traditional lodging properties. I can actually say that I have family that has significant food allergies, and traveling can be really stressful. So as a family, a lot of times when we're traveling, we do use STRs because we prefer a kitchen and we can control that input and output. I think the number one rule in real estate, and generally, if we're going to go with cliches here, is just location, location, location. And I think that gets at some of the association's feelings that you heard around a patchwork, as well as some of the feelings you heard around it. This is a bigger problem in some communities in Vermont than it is in others. And I think we can talk about that patchwork of regulation, but we live in a Dillon rule state, and we have, a lot of different personalities in each community. And one of the things we see is that folks address this differently. In my community, Winooski, where I have my, short-term rental, they do require a registry, and they do limit the number of non-owner occupied. There's not much more else than that. It's a relatively new thing. But folks are addressing it in communities where they feel like this is a problem. I think we also have had conversations in this state around how to get that data. We've, in the past 6 years, I think ever since I've been in this role with the Lake Chamber, so 7 years going on, we've talked about a statewide rental registry. We've talked about a statewide short-term rental registry. I think the Lake Chamber at times was saying, why don't we bifurcate the two? It seems like there's a lot of consent around going with a short-term rental registry for all the reasons that folks have talked about today, but maybe avoiding a long-term rental registry because that just doesn't seem politically palatable. I think that's been a component as long as I can remember. What else? I'm trying to be quick, like I said, but I think there's the old adage, cliche, whatever, if it moves, tax it, if it keep moving, regulate it, stop moving, subsidize it. I think you're, in the second part of it where, we did put a surcharge on these last year. I think we still need to understand how that's affecting those units. I think that's going to be an interesting, short-term rental tax remittance is kind of unique in that a lot of the time it's operating under an MOU with the platforms and the tax department, and they're remitting. So I'm not sure exactly how that works, but I think we want to see the tax data on that. And then understand, I would like to understand better, how that might be affecting the industry. I think we already have high rooms and meals tax in the state. That surcharge certainly does add a little bit more when a visitor's looking at coming here to the state. And then, I think when we talk about housing supply, there are probably impacts. I think that it's correct, and they've been characterized as somewhat negligible, that the impacts that they're having on the broader economy. And there's plenty of positive impacts that STRs are having on our economy. I think at the end of the day, the crux of the issue is that we just don't have adequate housing supply in this state. Our vacancy rates are very low, and instead of going after a negligible amount of the housing supply that might be pulled into this and may not be pulled into this, it's just going to behoove us all to just go after the crux of the problem, which is we're just not building an adequate enough housing every single year to meet our demands. And then there's a whole host of other things. I just testified 2 days ago in House Ways and Means on, some of the ways that we tax our income sensitivity programs, some of the impacts that has on creating golden handcuffs, keeping people in places that they might otherwise want to leave. And understanding some of the mismatch that we have in our state between folks who are frankly overhoused and underhoused, some of the folks who are, being encouraged to age in place in places that aren't really ideal to age in place. While we have folks who are underhoused in homes that they can't grow their family in. So we have a lot of other dynamics in the housing arena that I think we need to address that might be a better use of our limited finite time and give us much higher marginal impact.
Do you hear from the sector that you represent, the hotel sector, hostility to the B and Bs because to short-term rental and that they eat away at their market?
I think there's, again, with everything, there's nuance. I think that there's some folks who look at the disparate treatment of hotels and Airbnbs or B&Bs and Airbnbs. And they say, the laundry list of things I have to deal with when it comes to the health department, the, number of state lists I'm on for people to drop by with, XYZ, the things I have to deal with fire code. I think there's a slight frustration there. I also think that those folks, understand, like I said, this is part of the visitor economy. It's an important part of the visitor economy. And they also, they don't necessarily, I think that their issue is actually more with the regulation put on them and maybe a slight envy of the regulation they see on the short-term rental folks, less than it is like a pull them down to where we are. So I think that's, you'll get many different responses if you talk to lodging properties, but that's the general gist of it.
Real quick, I was just gonna say, I appreciate you also bringing up that, hotels don't always work for everyone. I don't have family here anymore, and when they visit me, they all want to stay together in one house with their kids, my nieces and nephews, and they visit in South Burlington and stay at Airbnb, and then we can all, because I live in a small condo, so they can't stay with me, and so it's nice, we can all stay together as a family and hang out. So I appreciate the nuances and different needs for people.
And South Burlington has been grappling with short-term rentals, and I believe that they've gone through the regulatory regime.
Yeah.
So,
A bit.
um,
But no, I'm grateful that those options do exist for people.
Any further questions of Austin at this time? Yes.
Just to clarify what we heard from CEDO about the short-term rental regulations, like that hypothetical of the person who's a snowbird and rents out short-term, that's kind of against the rules only in Burlington right now because of the regulations, or is it also true in Winooski or in other parts of the state?
currently in Winooski, the way that the short-term rental operates is that there's just a registration fee based off a smaller fee for owner occupied for the folks like myself who are just trying to pay the property tax bill with a little income during the eclipse and graduation weekend, things like that. And then there's a registration fee that's higher for non-owner occupied. The phase 2 of Winooski's regulation is going to involve a lottery system for a limited number of
Licenses.
non-owner occupied with no cap on owner occupied. So that's, kind of, it goes back to that patchwork. You're seeing, different communities, whether that be Burlington or across the bridge, South Burlington, or down the way, or across the other bridge, Winooski, they're all going at it in a way that they feel like is specific. And I can understand from an association perspective, like you heard earlier from Julie about the frustration with that patchwork. I think you've probably heard me, if you've been around the State House long enough, me come in and complain about the patchwork of regulation, and how certain things kind of get really just everyone addresses them. And then we have 250 some odd new rules to follow.
51.
Yeah.
CFS destruction.
Apologies for forgetting about the divorce.
That's right.
But,
I'm the second biggest city now.
But I think that you'll hear frustration, and that's doing business in Vermont. I think that you'll hear times that people will say, I'm frustrated with the patchwork. And then there are times people say, the patchwork's actually working out pretty well for me in this. And I think it's something we need to grapple with when it comes to, regional governance and everything else, that we talk about in the State House. I've been here a decade and we've had those conversations forever.
Yeah, they don't see a really big benefit to like just going one path or the other on this.
I think it needs
issue.
something to be explored. I do think, as Julie said earlier, like getting more data, I think will help. AirDNA is helpful. You were correct in that, having a snapshot in time isn't helpful, and being able to get a full perspective of how people enter and exit this market. I never thought about necessarily. If you want a fun anecdote, I didn't have a short-term rental until about late March, or I guess what would have been late March last year, when my dog got into something she shouldn't have, and I had to spend a very
vet
enormous
bills.
amount of money on a vet bill. And my wife was like, the eclipse is coming up. We've got this spare bedroom that we put on there, that we have for family, and we can host a complete stranger in it if we do X, Y, and Z. And she did a quick listing, and we got an incredible amount of money for that one unit, I will say. We haven't touched that since. We never will again, likely. But that was my first foray into having a short-term rental. And we might take it off if it's, we're hosting more family there consistently all the time, or if someone in the family falls on a rough time, or if we need the room, frankly, we're a growing family. But that kind of speaks to how folks are using this. It's an expensive state. A lot of us, the only asset we have is our home. So being able to leverage that asset, maybe welcome a stranger now and then, maybe while you take some time off to travel, whether that be say, I've got friends and family that are travel nurses. Like, if you're a traveler nurse and would leave that unit empty, then maybe it's better as a short-term rental,
Gail, last question, and then we've got to stop.
How do your neighbors feel about you having the short-term rental?
I haven't heard any complaints. I was really, upfront, about the rental. I talked to my neighbors, and I think that they're kind of, it's funny. My neighbor has an in-law apartment as well, with their mother in it as well. So, I think that they were kind of like, oh, that's a good idea.
And where do you get the people from that would rent?
So
Are they background checked, or are they through an agency?
Well, we're on Airbnb, and Airbnb has a great system of allowing folks to, rate previous stays. So, we can see a little profile on the person who's coming based off of how they've behaved at other Airbnbs. And, I think we're in a place where it can be a little bit more picky, and we don't have 5 stars. We probably don't want you, if someone's commented through a party, we're not interested in that. But, and I think that's a great thing about these platforms. But, we've gotten people who come for all the things that were listed, coming to see family that are just down the road and don't want to stay in the house with family, coming to stay a couple weeks and work here, because they're a remote worker for a Vermont company, coming to EM graduation, or, all sorts of things. So that runs a gamut.
Why don't I think what we should do is adjourn, and if you'd stay a minute, if anybody has questions, are you up for that?
Yeah.
Okay. So